The morning Celeste Adaora found the dress, she was not looking for anything at all. That is the thing about the moments that rearrange your life. They do not arrive with warning. They do not give you time to prepare a face for what is coming. They arrive in the ordinary middle of an ordinary Tuesday, while you are simply looking for a scarf or a pair of shoes, or something you set down and forgot. And then suddenly the floor is not where it was and the walls are not where they were and the whole shape of the world you thought you were standing in has shifted into something unrecognizable. Celeste was 34 years old and she had been married to Emeka for 6 years. 6 years of the kind of marriage that looked, from the outside, like something other people envied. The house in Lekki Phase 2 with its cream-colored walls, and its garden that Celeste tended on weekend mornings with the focused pleasure of someone who finds genuine peace in growing things. The dinner parties where Emeka laughed his big, generous laugh and refilled glasses before they were empty and made every guest feel like the most important person in any room he had ever entered. The photographs on their mantelpiece, the two of them at their wedding in Abuja, at the beach in Calabar the year after, at her sister Adanna's graduation ceremony 3 years ago when Adanna had finished her master's degree and cried happy tears, and Celeste had held her and Emeka had stood beside them with his arm around Celeste's shoulders, grinning. She had loved him. That is the thing she would return to again and again in the weeks that followed. She had loved him completely and without reservation, the way you love someone when you have decided they are where you are going to put your whole heart, without keeping any piece of it back as insurance against what might happen if you were wrong. She was not looking for a reason to doubt him when she opened that closet door. She was looking for the navy scarf she had left there 3 weeks ago. She had been cold that morning, the kind of cold that arrives in Lagos in January when the harmattan comes down from the north and turns the air dry and grainy and strips the warmth from even the best insulated rooms. She had gone to the main bedroom, to the tall mahogany wardrobe that she and Emeka shared, and she had moved through her side without finding it. Then she had tried his side, because her things had a habit of migrating across the invisible line that divided the wardrobe between them. Small domestic migrations that happened without intention, and had always seemed to her like one of the many quiet ways a shared life makes itself known. The scarf was not there. She reached further back into the hanging clothes, pushing aside the suits Emeka wore to his law firm, the rows of crisp shirts that she ironed on Sunday evenings with the radio playing in the background, the casual blazers he liked on weekends. Her fingers found something at the very back, pushed against the far panel, concealed behind the weight of his winter coats. The fabric was not like anything that belonged in this wardrobe. She pulled it forward slowly. It was white. It was white and it was layered and it was unmistakably a wedding dress. A full gown of white silk and broderie anglaise lace, floor length, with long sleeves that ended in a delicate cuff and a neckline that she would have recognized in her sleep because she had sat beside her sister while a seamstress marked the measurements for it with small pins and a piece of chalk, and Adanna had stood very still in the middle of the fitting room in that bridal shop in Ikeja and said, very quietly, "This is the one." Celeste stood holding the dress. The wardrobe door was still open. The harmattan air moved through the room and she did not feel it. Adanna's wedding was scheduled for the 14th of March, 8 weeks away. The dress was supposed to be at the seamstress's studio in Victoria Island, where it had been taken 3 months ago for the final fitting and alterations. Celeste had driven Adanna there herself. She had sat in the small waiting area with 2 cups of tea while the seamstress made her final marks, and Adanna stood on the raised platform with her arms slightly out from her sides and her eyes bright, not quite daring to look at herself in the mirror yet, as though the reality of the thing was still too large to look at directly. That was where the dress was supposed to be. It was in her husband's wardrobe. Celeste stood for a long time holding it. She was not yet crying. She had not yet arrived at crying. She was somewhere before that, in the interior chamber of grief where the mind is still trying to construct an explanation that makes sense, that renders the thing in front of you into something other than what it obviously is. There was an explanation. There had to be an explanation. Emeka had picked it up for some reason. The seamstress had called and asked someone to collect it, and Emeka had offered and had not mentioned it because it had slipped his mind and he had put it here just temporarily and had forgotten to tell her. She ran through every version of this. She ran through every version of every explanation that did not require her to think the thing she was beginning to think. Not one of them held. If you're already feeling something stir in your chest, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And if this story is already speaking to you, please hit the like button and subscribe. It means more than you know, and it helps us keep bringing you stories like this one. She laid the dress carefully across the bed. She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists the way her mother had taught her to do when emotion threatened to overwhelm her capacity to think clearly. A small practical trick that had always worked in every previous situation in which she had needed it. Then she went back and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the dress and made herself think carefully. She called the seamstress. The phone rang 4 times and then Madame Bose answered in the bright, slightly hurried manner of a woman whose mornings were always busy with fittings and pinning and the particular pressures of other people's most important days. Celeste kept her voice very steady. She asked whether the dress had been collected. Madame Bose said yes. She said it without hesitation. She said a man had come to collect it 2 weeks ago. She said he had had the receipt and had known all the details and had said he was collecting it on behalf of the family. Celeste asked her to describe him. Madame Bose described Emeka. Celeste thanked her and ended the call. She sat on the bed for a long time. Then she picked up her phone again and called her sister. Adanna answered on the second ring with the voice of a woman whose life was currently organized around the singular consuming project of a wedding that was 8 weeks away. A voice full of lists and timelines and the cheerful controlled anxiety of someone who has given themselves permission to care enormously about one specific thing for one specific period of time. "Has your dress been collected from Madame Bose?" Celeste asked. A pause. Adanna said, "What do you mean collected?" "The dress is with Madame Bose. She is still finishing the hem." Celeste looked at the white silk spread across her bed. "I will call you back," she said. She did not tell Adanna what she had found. Not then. She hung up and sat in the particular silence of a woman who has just understood something she cannot yet bring herself to say out loud, because saying it out loud will make it real in a way that it is not yet entirely real, and real is the thing she is not yet ready to have it be. She thought about Adanna. Adanna was 29 years old, and she was the kind of person who made every room she entered feel more alive. She was the younger sister by 5 years, but she had always had a quality of presence that made her seem ageless, as though she operated on some frequency slightly above the one that the rest of the world occupied and the rest of the world was simply grateful to be in range of it. She laughed at things with her whole body. She cried at films and at the news and at beautiful music and at the sight of elderly couples holding hands in traffic, and she was completely unembarrassed by all of this because she had decided a long time ago that a person's capacity for feeling was not a weakness to be managed but a strength to be inhabited. She made friends everywhere she went. She remembered the names of the children of people she had met twice. She sent birthday messages that were actually personal, that contained something specific and real and true about the person they were written for, because she had paid attention, because she always paid attention. She was marrying a man named Chidera Obi in 8 weeks. Chidera was a quiet, thoughtful architect from Enugu who had met Adanna at a mutual friend's birthday dinner 2 years ago, and had spent the entire evening talking to her about the way buildings hold memory, which was the kind of conversation Adanna would walk toward from across a crowded room. He was good. Celeste had understood this about him from the beginning. Not good in the performed way, not good in the way of a man presenting his best qualities to the family of the woman he was courting. Good in the structural way, in the way that goes all the way through a person and does not change when no one is watching. He was good and Adanna loved him, and they were 8 weeks from the beginning of their life together, and Adanna's wedding dress was on Celeste's bed because Emeka had collected it from the seamstress 2 weeks ago and put it at the back of his side of the wardrobe and had not said a single word about it to either his wife or his sister-in-law. Celeste was still sitting on the bed when she heard the car in the drive. Emeka came home early on Tuesdays because the partners' meeting ended at noon and he usually went to the gym after and was home by 2. She heard the engine, the click of the gate, the sound of footsteps on the front path. She heard his key in the lock. She heard him call her name from the downstairs hallway in the ordinary way, with the ordinary warmth of a man coming home to his wife in his house at the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She did not answer. She heard him come up the stairs. He appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. He saw her sitting on the edge of the bed, and he saw the dress spread across it beside her, and she watched the change happen on his face in real time. It was not guilt, not immediately. The first thing was surprise, the involuntary and unmanaged surprise of someone who has been confronted by something they were not expecting to face today. And then behind that, very quickly, the other thing. The thing she had been hoping she would not see. The calculation. the assessment of the situation, the beginning of the construction of a response. Celeste, he said. She did not speak. He stepped into the room. He put his gym bag on the floor. He looked at the dress. He looked at her. He made a decision about his face and settled it into something that looked like concern, and she watched him make that decision. She watched the mechanics of it, and something that had been uncertain in her up until that moment became entirely certain. "Where did this come from?" he said. His tone was careful. He was giving himself time. "From your wardrobe," she said. Her voice was very calm. She had discovered sometime in the years since her father's death, and then her mother's illness, and then the miscarriage 2 years ago, that she had a capacity to be completely calm inside situations that should have broken her. A capacity she had not chosen and did not particularly admire, but which she had come to understand was simply how she was built. She did not go to pieces when things went badly. She went very still, and she waited, and she observed. She was observing now with everything she had. "I was picking it up for Adanna," Emeka said. A small silence. Madame Bose called and said the alterations were done, and I offered to collect it. I was going to take it to her this week. His voice was reasonable. His posture was arranged to support the reasonableness of his voice. Celeste asked him when Madame Bose had called. He said 2 weeks ago, approximately. She asked him why he had not mentioned it to her. He said he had meant to. He had simply forgotten. It had slipped his mind. She asked him why he had not mentioned it to Adanna, who had called the studio 3 days ago inquiring about the status of the hem and had been told everything was complete. A fractional pause. Long enough for a person who was paying the kind of attention she was paying to register it precisely. He said Adanna had not called him. He said perhaps there had been a communication issue with the studio. Celeste looked at him. She looked at him with the full force of 6 years of learning the specific map of his face. Every expression he had and how it moved and what it meant and what it concealed. She looked at him and she understood. Standing in that moment with her sister's wedding dress spread across the bed between them, that she was looking at a man who was lying to her. Not sloppily, not desperately, but with the practiced fluency of someone who has been lying for long enough that the architecture of it has become familiar territory. She did not say this. She stood up and took the dress carefully from the bed and folded it over her arm. She said she would take it to Adanna herself. He watched her do this. He said, "Celeste." He said her name the way he said it when he was trying to reach her across a distance of his own making. She picked up her car keys from the dresser. She did not look at him when she left the room. She drove to Adanna's flat in Surulere in the particular silence of a woman who has made the decision, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, not to think beyond the immediate task. The immediate task was returning the dress. Everything beyond that could wait until she was somewhere alone, and the immediate task was behind her. Adanna was home. She answered the door in paint-stained joggers and an old university sweatshirt, her locks pinned up, an expression of the mild, concentrated distraction of someone who had been in the middle of something creative and had not yet fully left it. She looked at Celeste and then at the dress folded over her arm, and her expression shifted. Celeste said, "Madame Bose called Emeka 2 weeks ago to say the alterations were complete. He collected it. He had not told her. She had found it this morning at the back of his wardrobe." She said it simply and without decoration because Adanna was her sister and had been her sister for 29 years, and there was no world in which she would manage the truth of what she had found into something more comfortable before she brought it to her. Adanna looked at her for a moment. Then she took the dress from Celeste's arm without a word and laid it across the sofa in her small sitting room and sat down beside it. She was very still in the way she was still when she was thinking hard about something. Her fingers rested lightly on the silk. After a long moment she said, "Why would he do that?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a person trying to construct something that could hold the weight of the fact they had just been given. Celeste sat in the chair across from her. She said she did not know. Adanna looked at the dress. She said, "Has he given you any explanation?" Celeste said she had given him the opportunity to give one, and that she had not believed what he offered. Silence. Then Adanna said very quietly, "This is not the first thing." Celeste went still. Adanna looked up at her. Her face was doing something careful. It was the face of a person who has been holding something for a long time and is deciding in this moment whether the cost of continuing to hold it is greater than the cost of setting it down. She said, "I did not want to tell you, because I was not certain, because I thought I might be wrong and I did not want to be the person who put something in your marriage that turned out to be nothing." Celeste said, "Tell me." Adanna pressed her lips together. She said, 3 months ago I was at the Palms on a Saturday afternoon. I was with Ngozi from my office. We went for lunch and then we were looking at the shops and I saw him." She paused. "He was with a woman I did not know. They were in that corner restaurant near the ground floor entrance. And Celeste, it was not the way you sit with a colleague. It was not the way you sit with a friend." She was leaning toward him across the table and he was looking at her the way. She stopped. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he is in the middle of something with, she said. "That particular attention. I know the difference. I was not imagining it." Celeste sat with this. She asked why Adanna had said nothing. Adanna looked at her steadily. "Because you are happy," she said. "You have seemed happy. And I was not certain enough to say something that I could not take back. And so I carried it and I told myself I would find another moment or another sign, and if I was sure I would tell you." She looked at the dress beside her. "And now there is a dress," she said. They sat together in the small sitting room for a long time without speaking. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Outside, the sounds of the street went on in their ordinary way. A car horn, someone calling a name, the distant bass of music from a generator 3 buildings over. All of it continuing as it always had, indifferent to the fact that in this room 2 sisters were sitting with something that had changed the shape of everything. Celeste thought about the woman Adanna had described. She thought about 2 weeks. 2 weeks that the dress had been sitting at the back of a wardrobe that she shared with a man she had been married to for 6 years, and he had said nothing, and she had gone in and out of that room every day and had had no idea, and the not knowing had not felt like anything because not knowing never feels like anything until the moment it does. She thought about Emeka calling her name from the downstairs hall when he came home. The ordinary warmth of it. How completely ordinary it had sounded. How entirely it had seemed like exactly what it always was. A man coming home to his wife. She was not crying. She noticed this with a distant kind of attention. She thought she probably would, eventually. But right now she was somewhere before that, in the place where the understanding is still arriving and there is not yet room for anything else. She looked at her sister. She said, "I need to know everything. Whatever you saw and whatever you have noticed and whatever you chose not to tell me. I need all of it now." Adanna nodded. She drew a long breath. And she began. What Adanna told her over the next hour was not a story of dramatic certainties. It was a collection of small things, the kind of small things that look like nothing when they are singular and look like something else entirely when they are gathered together in one place and examined as a whole. A text message Adanna had seen on Emeka's phone at a family dinner 8 months ago. A name she did not recognize, sent at a time that seemed strange. A weekend business trip to Port Harcourt that Adanna had later learned, through the ordinary accident of a mutual acquaintance mentioning it in passing, had not been a conference Emeka's firm had organized. A way he had of being slightly elsewhere sometimes in conversations, present in body and absent in the specific quality of attention that people offer when they are fully there, that Adanna had noticed without being able to name precisely why it registered as strange. Each of these things, told to her singly, Celeste would have found an explanation for. Together, sitting in her sister's flat with her sister's wedding dress folded on the sofa and the Harmattan afternoon going gray outside the window, she could not find an explanation for any of them. She drove home an hour later. Emeka was in the kitchen making tea when she came in. He turned when he heard her. His face arranged itself into the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours working on what he was going to say and was now prepared to say it. She could see the preparation in him. She recognized it. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down. She said, "I have spoken to Adanna." He paused with the kettle in his hand. She said, "I want you to tell me the truth. Not the version you have prepared. The actual truth. And I want you to understand before you decide what to do with that request that I will know the difference." He set the kettle down. He stood for a moment with his back to her, looking at the counter. Then he turned around. And for the first time since he had appeared in the bedroom doorway with his gym bag and his carefully arranged expression, she saw something that was not calculation. Something that looked like the very beginning of a man deciding that the architecture he has been maintaining has become too expensive to hold up. He sat down across from her. He said, "Her name is Yetunde." Celeste looked at him. He said, "It has been 11 months. The room was very quiet. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She sat across the kitchen table from her husband of 6 years, and she let what he was saying arrive inside her completely, without trying to manage it or soften it or organize it into something more bearable than what it was. She had learned in the hardest possible years of her life that the only way through a true thing was through it, that trying to go around it only meant you carried it longer, that the weight did not diminish by being avoided. 11 months, she said. Yes, he said. She asked him about the dress. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She asked me to pick up the dress. Yetunde. She said she needed it." Celeste looked at him. He said it very quietly and she heard it completely, and her mind did not move to the implications of it immediately because the implications of it were very large and she needed a moment before she let them arrive. "Why?" she said. He did not answer. He pressed his hands flat on the table and looked at them. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the room. She asked the question again. Why did Yetunde want the dress? He raised his eyes to hers. She saw in them the particular look of a man who has made a decision about truth and is committed to it but is not certain he can survive delivering it. "She wants to be married in it," he said. "We have been planning. I did not know how to tell you. If this story is hooking you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support is everything and it helps me bring you more stories like this one." Celeste sat very still. She sat very still for a long time, and the kitchen was quiet around her, and the afternoon light had shifted while they were talking and was now coming in at an angle through the window over the sink, and it fell across the table and across his hands pressed flat against the surface and across the space between them that had always looked like a kitchen table and was now something else entirely. She thought about Adanna. She thought about Adanna standing in that bridal shop in Acacia on the raised platform with her arms slightly out from her sides and her eyes bright and her voice saying very quietly, "This is the one." She thought about what a wedding dress is and what it means and what it costs a woman to stand inside one for the first time and feel the full reality of what it represents. She thought about a stranger wanting to be married in her sister's dress and what that meant about everything she did not yet know about the last 11 months of her own marriage. She stood up. She picked up her phone from the table. She said, "I need you to leave this house tonight. You can come back for your things when I have had time to think. But I need you out of this house tonight." He looked at her. He said her name. She said, "Emeka. I am asking you clearly and I am asking you once." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up. He went to the hallway and picked up his gym bag from where he had left it beside the stairs. He found his car keys on the hook by the door. He paused with his hand on the door handle. He said, "I am sorry." She was standing in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him with the full weight of 6 years of learning the specific truth of who he was, and she said nothing. He opened the door and went out. She heard the car start. She heard it move out of the drive. She heard the sound of it going down the road until there was nothing left of it, and the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood filled in behind it like water filling a space. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a very long time. Then she went to the sitting room and sat on the sofa and called her mother. Her mother, Mrs. Grace Adaora, was 61 years old and had lived alone in the family house in Bagada since Celeste's father had died 9 years ago. She had a quality of stillness about her that Celeste had spent her entire life trying to understand. A stillness that was not absence but presence of a very particular kind. The presence of a woman who had decided at some point during the difficult years of raising 2 daughters mostly alone while her husband traveled for work that she would not be moved by the things that were designed to move people off their foundation. She was not cold. She was not remote. She was simply grounded in a way that very few people are, grounded in her own knowledge of herself and of what mattered and of what did not. When Celeste told her what had happened, her mother listened without interrupting. She listened to all of it, the wardrobe, the dress, the conversation with Adanna, the 11 months, the name Yetunde, the information about the dress. When Celeste finished, there was a long silence. Then her mother said, "Are you alone in the house?" Celeste said yes. Her mother said she would be there in 40 minutes. She was there in 35. She came through the front door with a container of food she had made that afternoon, as though she had known before the phone rang that her daughter would need something warm to eat before the evening was out. She set it on the kitchen counter and turned on the stove. She did not ask Celeste to tell her any of it again. She had heard it once, and she had held it, and it was there, and there was no benefit to moving it around inside a room where it had already done its damage for the night. She made jollof rice and fried plantain, and she brought 2 plates to the table and sat down and said, "Eat." Celeste sat across from her mother at the kitchen table where she had sat across from Emeka 3 hours ago, and she picked up her fork. They ate in silence for a while. Then her mother said, "You have done the right thing asking him to leave tonight. A woman should not have to sit in the same rooms as a man who has done what he has done while she is still in the first hours of knowing it. The body needs space before the mind can work." Celeste looked at her. Her mother said, "Tomorrow you will begin to think about what you need to do. Tonight you simply need to eat and to rest and to let tonight be exactly what it is. An ending and not yet a beginning. Those are different and both of them are necessary, and you cannot rush from one to the other." Celeste said, "Adanna's wedding is in 8 weeks. Her mother was quiet for a moment. She set down her fork. She said, "I know." She said, "Adanna does not need to know tonight what you have told me. Adanna needs to continue believing for a little longer that the man who collected her dress did it for a straightforward reason that got confused somehow. Let her have tonight and tomorrow and perhaps the day after that. And then you and I will sit down together and we will decide how to tell her and when and what it will need from both of us when we do." Celeste looked at her mother. She said, "Mama, he said Yetunde wanted the dress. He said they were planning. He said he did not know how to tell me." Her mother held her gaze. She said, "I heard you. I heard every word." She said, "That woman is not getting your sister's dress. I want you to be clear about that. Whatever else is uncertain, that particular thing is not." Something moved through Celeste's chest. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The specific sensation of a person who has been holding something enormous alone for several hours and has just been joined by someone who is capable of helping to carry it. She looked at her mother across the kitchen table. She said, "What do I do?" Her mother said, "The first thing you do is sleep. And then in the morning you get up and you call Franklin Adeyemi because he handled your father's estate and he is the most trustworthy man I know in law, and you tell him exactly what you have told me and you let him tell you what your options are." She paused. She said, "You are not going to let this become something that destroys you or your sister or this family. You are going to let it become the thing that tells you exactly what you are made of. And I already know what you are made of. I have been watching you be made of it for 34 years. Celeste sat with that. Outside, the January harmattan moved through the garden, through the things she had planted and tended with the focused pleasure of a woman who found genuine peace in growing them, and the sound of it came through the window like something. Breathing. She picked up her fork and continued eating. Her mother ate beside her and said nothing more, and the two of them sat together in the kitchen while the evening completed itself around them, and Celeste began, very slowly and very carefully, to understand that the shape of the thing she was in the middle of was not the shape of the end of something. It was the shape of the beginning of something she did not yet have the language for. And language, her mother had always told her, comes when you are ready for it. She was going to need to be ready soon. She slept. That surprised her most of all the following morning, that she had slept at all. She had expected to lie in the dark for the full length of the night with the ceiling above her, and the empty side of the bed beside her, and the knowledge of everything she now knew moving through her in the relentless circling way that difficult knowledge moves through a person when there is nothing left to do about it until morning. She had expected hours of that. Instead she had fallen asleep before 10 and had not woken until the gray pre-dawn light was beginning to come through the curtains and her mother's voice was coming from the direction of the kitchen, low and steady and already in motion, already managing the beginning of a day the way her mother always managed beginnings, with the quiet competence of a woman who understood that the world does not pause for grief and that breakfast is, in the end, a form of resistance. Mrs. Grace Adaora had slept in the guest room. She had not announced this intention and Celeste had not asked her to stay, but when Celeste had come upstairs at 10 o'clock her mother had been making up the guest bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who has made up many beds in many difficult circumstances and considers it one of the most useful things a person can do for someone else. She had said goodnight and closed the door, and that had been that. Celeste came downstairs to find Akamu on the stove and her mother seated at the kitchen table with a small notebook open in front of her and a pen in her hand, writing things in the careful, deliberate script she had used for as long as Celeste could remember. Her mother looked up. She did not say good morning in the way of someone making an assessment about whether the morning deserved the designation. She simply looked at her daughter's face with the attention of someone who has been looking at that face for 34 years and can read it the way other people read text. She said, "Sit down and eat first. Then we will talk." Celeste sat. She ate. The Akamu was warm and familiar in the way that the foods of childhood are always warm and familiar, carrying something that is not quite taste and not quite memory but exists in the overlap between them. She ate all of it, and her mother refilled her cup of tea without being asked and then sat back down with her notebook. She said, "I made a list last night of the things that need to happen and in what order. Tell me if I have missed anything." She read from the list. The first thing was the lawyer. Franklin Adeyemi, who had offices in Marina and who had handled the Adaora family's legal affairs for 20 years, beginning with Celeste's father's estate and continuing through 2 property transactions and a business dispute involving her mother's fabric shop that had been resolved cleanly and without drama because Franklin Adeyemi was the kind of lawyer who understood that the objective was resolution and not performance. The second thing was the dress. Celeste looked at her mother when she said this. Her mother said, "The dress is not a small matter. It is your sister's wedding dress. It was made for your sister's body by a woman who has been fitting brides for 30 years and who took measurements and made adjustments specific to Adanna alone. No other woman is wearing that dress. That is not a negotiable point. That is simply a fact that needs to be established clearly and early so that no confusion arises about it later." Celeste nodded. The third thing her mother said was Adanna. She said this with the specific gravity of a woman who understands that some conversations are the most important ones a person will ever have, and that the most important ones require the most careful preparation. She said, "Adanna needs to know. Not everything immediately, not in one conversation in which she is handed the entire weight of it without anything to hold on to. But she needs to know enough to understand what has been done and what is being done about it. And she needs to hear it from you and from me together, not separately, not through someone else, not in fragments that arrive over days and leave her filling in the spaces with her own imagination, which will be worse than the truth." Celeste asked when. Her mother said, "Today. This afternoon. Before Emeka has any opportunity to reach her first with his version of events." Celeste had not thought about this. She thought about it now and understood immediately why her mother had put it on the list. Emeka knew that Adanna knew about the dress. He had been in the room when Celeste said she had spoken to Adanna. He had sufficient information to make a calculation about damage control, and he was a lawyer and damage control was a language he spoke fluently. If he reached Adanna before they did and offered her something that sounded like an explanation, something that minimized the facts or reframed them or placed them in a context that made them seem like less than what they were, Adanna might receive it. Not because she was foolish, she was far from foolish, but because she was 8 weeks from her wedding and she was human, and humans in the middle of the happiest periods of their lives have a powerful and understandable instinct to protect that happiness from things that threaten it. She said, "You are right." Her mother said, "I know." She closed the notebook. She looked at Celeste across the table with the direct, unhurried gaze of a woman who has something important to say and has decided to say it now. She said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly without worrying about what the answer means or what it says about you or what I will think of it." Celeste said, "Ask me." Her mother said, "How long have you known that something was wrong?" A silence. Celeste looked at her tea. She turned the cup slowly in her hands. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved because her mother was asking it with seriousness and because she owed it an honest answer and because the honest answer was the only thing that would be of any use to either of them in the conversation they were going to need to have. She said, 8 months, perhaps. Her mother did not react to this. She simply waited. Celeste said, "Nothing I could name. Nothing I could point to. Just a quality of distance in him that had not been there before. A way of being slightly elsewhere in the middle of conversations. Phone calls he took in the study with the door closed, which he had never done before, and which he had explanations for that were always reasonable and which I believed because I had no reason not to and because I did not want a reason. She paused. She said, I think I chose not to look too closely. I think I understood at some level that looking closely would show me something I was not ready to see, and so I found ways to look at other things instead. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is not a moral failure. That is a human being protecting herself until she was ready. The question is not why you did not look sooner. The question is what you do now that you have looked. Celeste held her gaze. She said, I know what I do. Her mother said, tell me. She said, I protect Adanna and I protect myself, and I do not allow any version of this to become a story in which the women in this family are the ones who are diminished by what a man chose to do. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, good. Now let us go and see Franklin. Franklin Adeyemi's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Broad Street that had been standing since before independence and had the quality of age without shabbiness that only certain buildings in Lagos achieved. The quality of something that had been maintained with care across a very long time because the people who used it understood that solid foundations were worth the cost of upkeep. The waiting room had wooden floors and tall windows that looked out at the harbor, and a receptionist named Mr. Femi who had been at his desk for 17 years, and who greeted Mrs. Grace Adaora by name with the warm recognition of a man for whom familiar faces are a pleasure. Franklin himself was 70 years old with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses that he pushed up and down the bridge of his nose while he listened, which he did with the full and undivided quality of attention that distinguished the truly excellent lawyers from the merely competent ones. He had the manner of a man who had heard a very great many difficult stories over a very long career, and who had learned that the most useful thing he could offer in the first conversation was not advice but comprehension, complete and unhurried comprehension of the situation as it actually was before he said a word about what could be done. Celeste told him everything. She told it in the same undecorated way she had told her mother, without drama and without omission, beginning with the wardrobe and ending with Emeka's admission at the kitchen table the previous evening and his departure from the house. Franklin listened. He asked 4 questions, each of them precise and each of them revealing, to Celeste, the specific shape of the legal territory she was now standing in. He asked about the property, whose name it was in and how the purchase had been financed. He asked about shared accounts and individual accounts and what Emeka had access to that she did not and what she had access to that he did not. He asked about the business, because Celeste ran a small interior design firm from a studio in Yaba that she had built over 7 years and that had nothing to do with Emeka legally, but whose financial health could be affected by the turbulence of a divorce proceeding if that proceeding was managed without care. He asked about children and there were none, and she watched him note this without expression. Then he set down his pen and looked at her over the top of his glasses. He said, you are in a stronger position than you may feel right now. The house is in your name. You purchased it before the marriage and you have documentation of this. Your business is separately established and legally distinct from your marital assets. The joint account has been used for household expenses and can be audited if necessary, but it does not represent your primary financial exposure. He paused. He said, the matter of the dress is not a legal matter in the technical sense, but it speaks to a pattern of behavior and of intention that will be relevant if this proceeds as I expect it will proceed. She asked him what he meant. He said, a man who takes his mistress his wife's sister's wedding dress, intending for that woman to be married in it, is a man who has made a decision about the future that he has not communicated to his wife. He has not merely been unfaithful. He has been planning a different life and concealing that planning from you actively and deliberately. That is a different category of thing. It will matter. Celeste sat with this. Her mother sat beside her and said nothing. She had not said anything since they arrived. She did not need to. Franklin said, I will prepare a formal letter to Emeka's home address, not his office, notifying him that you are seeking legal counsel and requesting that he make no financial transactions from any joint accounts until further notice. I will also advise him, through proper channels, that any contact he makes with your sister directly about matters related to this situation should be conducted through legal representation. That will prevent him from attempting to manage the narrative through her. Celeste said, can you have that ready today? Franklin looked at her over his glasses. He said, Mr. Femi will have it ready within the hour. They were back in the car by 11 o'clock. Celeste's mother called Adanna from the passenger seat and said, We are coming to see you this afternoon at 3. Please be home. Please do not make any plans. Adanna started to ask a question and her mother said, "We will explain when we arrive." She said it in the voice that had ended 1,000 childhood questions, and Adanna, who was 29 years old and had been obeying that voice since she was born, said, "Yes, Mama," and rang off. Celeste drove. She did not speak for several minutes. The Lagos traffic moved around them in its ordinary way, dense and loud and entirely indifferent to the interior weather of any of the vehicles caught within it. After a while she said, "Do you think she already suspects something?" Her mother looked out the passenger window. She said, "Adanna has always been more perceptive than she lets people see. She shows you her warmth and her openness, and she lets that be what people know about her. But she sees a great deal more than she speaks." Celeste thought about her sister at the Palms, watching Emeka across a restaurant with a woman she did not know, carrying what she saw for 3 months without saying a word because she was not certain enough and did not want to be wrong and did not want to put something into her sister's marriage that turned out to be nothing. She said, "She has been protecting me." Her mother said, "Yes." She said, "The same way I was protecting myself." Her mother turned and looked at her. She said, "You are both your father's daughters." He was the same. He would carry something for a very long time rather than speak it before he was sure. He believed that words, once said, cannot be unsaid, and that the cost of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment was too high. A pause. She said he was right about that. He was also sometimes too cautious. There is a version of protecting people that becomes a way of protecting yourself from the difficulty of the conversation. I think you both understand this. Celeste drove. She thought about 8 months of choosing not to look too closely. She thought about Adanna carrying 3 months of what she saw at the Palms. She thought about all the weight that had been distributed quietly across the women of this family, while a man sat in the middle of it conducting a separate life with the casual confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of being found out. She said, "He thought we would not compare notes." Her mother said, "Men who do what he has done always believe the women around them are more isolated from each other than they actually are." She said it simply, without heat, as a statement of observed fact. Celeste made a left turn off the main road. She said he was wrong about that. Her mother said, "Yes, he was." They stopped for food before going to Adanna. Celeste's mother insisted on this with the same practical insistence she had brought to the Akamu that morning. She said, "You do not deliver difficult news to someone you love on an empty stomach. You eat first. You steady yourself. Then you go." They ate at a small restaurant in Surulere that Celeste's mother had been going to for 15 years. A place with no pretensions and very good pepper soup, and a proprietress named Mama Chisholm, who brought extra food without being asked and called everyone she liked by a name that was not their name. She called Mrs. Grace Adaora by the name Mama Blessing, and had done so for 15 years, and neither of them had ever explained or resolved this. They ate. They did not speak very much. Celeste's mother ate with the focused appreciation of someone who considers good food a form of grace and does not dilute it with unnecessary conversation. Celeste ate because her mother had told her to and because her body understood, at some level below thought, that what was coming this afternoon was going to require everything she had. At 3 o'clock they knocked on Adanna's door. Adanna opened it. She was dressed this time, in a yellow blouse and dark trousers, her hair down. She had cleaned the flat and there was tea already made on the kitchen counter, which told Celeste that Adanna had understood from their mother's phone call that whatever was coming required a clean space and a hot drink, the small practical preparations of a woman bracing herself with the tools she had available. She looked at her mother and then at Celeste, and something in her face said that she already knew, not the details, not the specific facts, but the shape of it, the general weight of what was in the room. She said, "Come in and sit down." They sat. Celeste's mother said, "Adanna, I am going to tell you something difficult, and I am going to tell it to you completely because you are an adult and because you deserve the truth and because there is no kind way to reduce what it is. So I am going to tell you all of it, and then you are going to feel whatever you feel, and we are going to sit here together for as long as you need." Adanna looked at her mother. She said, "Tell me." So Celeste told her. She told her about the wardrobe and the dress and the call to Madame Bose and the conversation with Emeka. She told her about Yetunde and the 11 months and the admission at the kitchen table. And then she told her the last part, the part she had not yet been able to fully examine herself, that Emeka had said Yetunde wanted the dress, that they had been planning, that he had taken her sister's wedding dress from the seamstress who had made it specifically for her sister's body, with the intention of giving it to another woman to be married in. When she finished, there was a silence. Adanna was looking at the wall across from her. Not at anything on the wall. At the specific middle distance that people look at when they are processing something that is happening inside them rather than outside them. Then she said, "He came to the fitting." Celeste looked at her. Adanna said, "Emeka came to the fitting at Madame Bose's studio. You were not there that day, you had a client meeting, you could not move. He said he wanted to come, he said he wanted to see it, he said he was family and he wanted to be part of it. I thought it was kind. I thought it was him being the kind of brother-in-law who shows up for things." She paused. She said, "He was there for an hour. He sat in that waiting room while I was fitted. He saw the whole thing. He saw the dress on me and he saw exactly how it looked and he sat there and he was kind and he was warm and at the end he said it was beautiful and that Chitara was going to be overwhelmed." A silence. She said, "He was measuring it." Celeste felt something move through her that was not grief and not anger but was in the space between them. Something closer to the feeling of looking at something that has revealed its true nature and understanding that you will never be able to see it the previous way again. Her mother said, "Adanna." Adanna turned and looked at her mother. Her face was doing something that Celeste had not seen it do very often. Adanna, who cried at films and at the news and at beautiful music, who felt things openly and without embarrassment, was not crying now. She was doing something harder than crying. She was being still. She said, "Chitara cannot know this yet." Her mother said, "No." She said, "Not until I have had time to think about how to tell him. He is going to want to do something, he is going to feel that something is owed, and I need to understand what I need before I bring him into it." Her mother said, "That is exactly right." Adanna looked at Celeste. She said, "You asked him to leave." Celeste said, "Last night." Adanna said, "Good." She said it simply and finally, the way you say a thing when you have assessed a situation and reached a conclusion and are done deliberating. She stood up. She went to the kitchen and poured 3 cups of tea and brought them back and set them on the low table and sat back down. Then she looked at her mother and her sister and she said, "Tell me what we are doing." Celeste told her about Franklin. She told her about the letter going to Emeka's address and the instruction that any contact with Adanna about the situation should go through legal representation. She told her about the assessment of the property and the business and the joint accounts. She told her about Franklin's phrase, "a different category of thing," and what he had meant by it. Adanna listened with the focused attention of a woman who has shifted from feeling into function, the shift that women in this family appeared to make when the situation required it, as though something in their shared inheritance included the capacity to move cleanly from one mode to the other when the moment demanded. When Celeste finished, Adanna said, "What about the dress?" Her mother said, "No other woman is wearing that dress. I said that to Celeste this morning and I am saying it to you now. That is not a discussion. That is simply what is." Adanna looked at her. Then, for the first time since they had come in and sat down, something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Something more complicated than a smile. Something that was grief and love and the specific feeling of a woman who understands that the people who love her most are capable of standing beside her in the worst moments without flinching and that this is not a small thing. She said, "I know, Mama." Her mother reached across and took her hand and held it. The 3 of them sat together in the small flat in Surreyr as the afternoon moved toward evening and they drank their tea, and they did not try to resolve everything immediately because some things cannot be resolved immediately and wisdom is knowing the difference. They sat with what they had been given and they let it be what it was and they were together in it, and that, for this particular afternoon, was what was needed most. Emeka called Celeste 4 times between 3 and 7 o'clock. She did not answer. He sent 2 messages, both of them variations of the same theme, that he needed to speak with her, that there were things she did not understand, that he wanted the opportunity to explain fully. She read them and did not respond. She forwarded them to Franklin, who confirmed he had received the formal notification and that any further contact of this nature could be added to the record. On the 3rd day after Emeka left the house, something happened that Celeste had not anticipated and that changed the shape of the situation in a way she was still absorbing a week later. Yetunde called her. She called from a number Celeste did not recognize, on a Thursday morning, at 8:45. while Celeste was at her studio in Yaba reviewing the material boards for a client project that was due the following week. The phone rang and the name on the screen was not a name but a number, and something in the quality of the ring made her answer it. Some instinct she could not have explained. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice. Calm and measured and younger than she had expected. She said, "Is this Celeste?" Celeste said yes. She said, "My name is Yetunde Fashola. I think you know who I am." Celeste sat down on the stool beside her drafting table. She said yes. A small silence. Then Yetunde said, "I am calling you because I think you deserve to hear some things from me directly. Not through Emeka's version. From me." Celeste said nothing. She waited. Yetunde said, "I did not know he was married when we met. I want to be clear about that. I know that is the thing everyone in my position says, and I know you have no reason to believe it, but it is true. He told me he was separated. He told me the marriage was over in everything but name and that the paperwork was being handled. He said this to me the night we met, and he maintained this account consistently for 4 months." She paused. She said, "I found out the truth 4 months ago. Not from him. From someone who knew both of you, who saw us together and who told me, I think because she felt I should know." Celeste said, "And you continued?" A silence. Yetunde said, "Yes. And I have no defense for that I am proud of. I had feelings for him that I had allowed to become larger than my judgment, and when I found out the truth, I made a choice that I would not make again if I were standing in the same moment now." Celeste held the phone. She said, "Why are you calling me?" Yetunde said, "Because of the dress." She said it quietly, and the way she said it carried something. Not guilt, not exactly. Something more like the specific discomfort of a person who has looked clearly at something they have done and cannot make it look like anything other than what it is. She said, "He brought the dress to my flat 3 days ago. He said it was a surprise. He said it was something he had arranged for us. He told me it belonged to a relative of his, a cousin who had changed her mind about the marriage and was giving it away." Celeste was completely still. Yetunde said, "I wore it once. I put it on in my flat and I stood in front of the mirror and I wore it for perhaps 10 minutes. Then I took it off. And the following morning I started asking questions because something felt wrong about it, about the whole story, about the way he had told it and the details that did not quite hold together. And by the end of the day I had found out whose dress it was." A pause. She said, "I am not calling you to ask for forgiveness. I am not calling you to explain myself. I am calling you because that dress belongs to your sister and it is in my flat and I want to return it to you, and I thought you deserved to hear from me directly rather than through lawyers or through Emeka, who will find a way to tell the story that protects himself at the expense of everyone else in it." Celeste sat in her studio with the material boards for her client project spread on the table in front of her, and the phone against her ear, and the Thursday morning traffic moving on the street below the window, and she thought about what it meant to make a call like this one. The specific cost of it. The particular kind of honesty it required. She said, "Where are you?" Yetunde gave her an address in Lekki Phase 1. Celeste said, "I will come at noon." She ended the call and sat for a long time in the studio. Then she called her mother. Her mother listened. When Celeste finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Go. Go and hear what she has to say and bring back the dress. And do not go alone." Celeste asked who she should bring. Her mother said, "Take Adanna." Celeste paused. She said, "Are you certain?" Her mother said, "That dress was made for Adanna. Whatever this woman has to say, Adanna has the right to be in the room when she says it. And Adanna is strong enough. Do not make the mistake of deciding she needs to be protected from something that is already hers to carry." Celeste thought about her sister in the small flat the day before, saying, "Tell me what we are doing," with the focused clarity of a woman who had shifted from feeling into function and was ready to work. She said, "You are right." She called Adanna. Adanna answered immediately. When Celeste told her what had happened and where they were going and why, there was a long silence. Then Adanna said, "I will be ready at 11:30. They drove to Lekki Phase 1 together. Adanna was in the passenger seat and she did not speak very much during the drive, but she was not absent in her silence the way that some people are absent in silence. She was present in it, fully present, gathering herself in the way of someone who knows that something large is coming and is choosing deliberately to arrive at it with full capacity rather than spending themselves in anticipation. The address was a block of flats on a quiet street behind a green gate. They pressed the bell and a voice came through the intercom and the gate opened. Yetunde met them at the door of the flat on the second floor. She was 31 years old. Celeste estimated. Medium height, with a face that was composed but not comfortable, the face of someone who has decided to do a difficult thing and is in the middle of doing it and is not going to let the difficulty become a reason to stop. She looked at Celeste and then at Adanna beside her, and something moved across her face when she saw Adanna. Something that was not quite recognition because they had not met, but something adjacent to it, the look of a person confronting a consequence of their choices in a form they had known intellectually was real but had perhaps not fully allowed to become real until this moment. She said, "Please come in." The flat was small and neat. There were books on a shelf and a plant in the window that was being looked after properly, and a desk in the corner with a laptop and the organized surface of someone who did their work at that desk and took the work seriously. There was nothing extraordinary about it. It was an ordinary flat belonging to an ordinary person who had made some choices that were not ordinary in the harm they had caused. On the sofa, folded carefully, was the dress. Adanna saw it immediately. She walked toward it without saying anything and stood before it and looked at it for a long moment. Then she bent and ran one hand across the silk with the specific gentleness of someone reacquainting themselves with something they had believed was safe and had discovered was not. Yetunde stood near the door. She looked at Adanna and then at Celeste and she said, "I am sorry. I am saying it to both of you and I am saying it knowing that it does very little. But I want you to hear it from me directly and I want you to know that I mean it." Adanna straightened. She turned and looked at Yetunde. Her face was not angry. It was something more complex than angry. It was the face of a woman looking clearly at another woman who has been caught in the path of someone else's dishonesty, and who has made her own choices within that, and who is now standing here doing the difficult thing rather than the easier one. She said, "Did you know, when he brought you the dress, that it was mine?" Yetunde said, "No. I found out afterward." Adanna said, "And when you found out?" Yetunde said, "I called your sister." Adanna looked at her for a long moment. Then she said that was the right thing to do. She said it without warmth, but also without cruelty. She said it the way you acknowledge a fact that deserves to be acknowledged even when the circumstances around it are painful. Yetunde said, "I ended things with Emeka 2 days ago. I want you to know that. I am not telling you because I expect it to change anything for you. I am telling you because you deserve to know the full truth of the situation as it stands." Celeste looked at her. She said, "How did he respond?" Yetunde said, "He was angry. Then he was apologetic. Then he called 4 times in the last 2 days and I have not answered." A silence. Celeste thought about 4 calls not answered and understood something about the kind of woman Yetunde was, independent of everything else she was, independent of the choices she had made and the harm she had contributed to. She was a woman who could make a decision and hold it. She said, "I have a lawyer. If Emeka contacts you in a way that feels threatening or coercive, I need you to document it and to let me know. Not for me, because the behavior pattern matters and documentation matters, and I want there to be a full and accurate record of how he operates." Yetunde looked at her. She said, "Yes, I can do that." Adanna picked up the dress from the sofa. She folded it carefully over her arm and held it against her. She looked at Yetunde one last time and said, "I hope you make better choices from here." It was not a small thing to say. It was not generous in the conventional sense. But it was true, and it was forward-facing, and it was, in its way, the most that the situation had any right to ask of Adanna in that particular room on that particular afternoon. Yetunde said, "I intend to." They left. In the car going back, Adanna held the dress in her lap with both hands. She did not speak for the first 10 minutes. Celeste drove and did not press her. Then Adanna said, "She told the truth in there." Celeste said, "I think she did." Adanna said, "She did not have to call you. She did not have to let us come. She did not have to be in that room when we arrived. She could have left the dress at the gate with the security man and sent a message. She chose to be there." Celeste said, "Yes." Adanna said, "That does not excuse what she did." Celeste said, "No." Adanna said, "But it is something." She looked out the window at the Lego streets moving past, at the ordinary life of the city continuing in its ordinary way, at the roadside sellers and the school buses and the yellow buses overloaded with afternoon passengers and the particular quality of the afternoon light that falls on Lagos in January when the harmattan is still present but beginning to soften. She said, "I need to tell Chidera." Celeste said, "When?" Adanna said, "Tonight. He needs to hear it from me before he hears it from anywhere else. And I need to tell him everything because he is the person I am going to marry, and I will not begin a marriage on a foundation of something I withheld because I was afraid of how he would respond." Celeste looked at her sister in the passenger seat with the dress across her lap and the afternoon light on her face. She said, "Do you want me there?" Adanna said, "No. This is mine to do." She said it with the same quiet finality she had used the day before, and Celeste recognized it for what it was. Not the bravery of someone who is not afraid. The courage of someone who is afraid and has decided to proceed anyway because the thing that is required is more important than the fear. She drove Adanna home and walked her to the door, and they stood at the entrance for a moment. Adanna said, "Celeste," she said, "whatever happens next, with Emeka, with all of it, I need you to know that you did not deserve this. Not any of it. You have been a good wife and a good sister and a good person, and none of what he chose has anything to do with what you are worth." Celeste looked at her sister. She said, "I know that." She said it and she meant it, mostly. She was still in the early part of knowing it, the part where you know it with your mind before you know it with the rest of yourself, the part where the knowledge exists but has not yet been fully absorbed into the body and the bones and the daily lived sense of who you are. But she was in that part, and she was moving through it, and her sister standing at the door with her wedding dress over her arm telling her the truth was part of what was moving her through it. She drove home. The house was quiet when she got there. The harmattan had picked up again and the garden was moving in it, the things she had planted bending slightly in the dry wind and recovering and bending again, as plants do, as things that are rooted always do, returning each time to the position they were designed to occupy. She stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden for a long time. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began making a list of her own. Not of what needed to happen legally. Franklin was handling that. Not of what needed to happen with Adanna. Adanna was handling that. A list of what needed to happen inside herself. She wrote 4 things. The first was to stop managing his image. She had been managing Emeka's image, she understood now, for longer than she had consciously admitted, in the way she spoke about him to people, in the way she absorbed his absences and his distances and provided explanations for them that protected his reputation and maintained the surface of the marriage as something that looked, from the outside, like a thing that was working. That was over. She was not going to lie on his behalf anymore. The second was to tell the truth about the miscarriage. She had not spoken about it to anyone except her mother and her doctor and Emeka, who had been present and then had retreated from it in the way she now understood was his pattern. Retreating from difficult things into distance and eventually into other people. She had carried the loss quietly because she had believed that carrying it quietly was a form of strength. She understood now that there were people in her life who loved her and who would have sat beside her in that loss if she had let them, and that not letting them had not been strength. It had been isolation dressed up as dignity. The third was to work. Not to lose herself in work, which was a different thing and which she recognized as a trap she had the capacity to fall into. But to work with the genuine pleasure she took in her work, the pleasure of making spaces that were coherent and beautiful and that served the people who inhabited them, the pleasure of a skill that was entirely hers and that had nothing to do with anyone else's choices or failures or needs. That pleasure had been available to her for 7 years, and she had sometimes allowed other things to obscure it. She was not going to allow that anymore. The 4th thing she wrote was the shortest. She wrote, "Find out who I am now." She sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and went to make herself dinner, and the garden went on moving in the harmattan wind outside the window, and the house was quiet around her, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a woman at the beginning of something. She was beginning to understand what that something was. Chidera Obi arrived at Adanna's flat at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening and left at 11:30. Adanna told Celeste about it the following morning on the phone, in the careful measured way she had when she was reporting something she had not yet finished processing, giving the facts first and letting the feeling arrive later when she had more room for it. She said he had listened. She said he had sat across from her at the kitchen table in the same chair their mother had sat in 2 days before, and he had listened to all of it without interrupting, without reaching for her hand prematurely, without trying to manage her delivery of it or soften the edges of what she was saying. He had simply listened with the full quality of a man who understands that some things require the full respect of being heard completely before any response is offered. When she finished, he had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, "Where is the dress now?" She had said it was in her wardrobe. He had said, "Good. That is where it belongs." Then he had asked her what she needed from him, and she had said she needed him to let her be angry for a while without trying to fix the anger. And he had said he could do that, and he had done it, sitting with her in the flat while she said the things she needed to say about what had been done and what it meant and what it had cost, and he had not tried to redirect or minimize or move her toward resolution before she was ready for resolution. He had stayed until 11:30, and when he left he had held her for a long time at the door and said, "8 weeks is still 8 weeks. I am still marrying you in 8 weeks. Whatever else this is, it is not that." Celeste listened to all of this and felt something that she had not expected to feel in the middle of everything she was carrying. Something close to gratitude. Not for the situation, not for any part of what had brought them to this point, but for Chidera Obi, who had sat across a kitchen table from her sister on a Thursday evening and proven himself completely and without theater to be exactly the man she needed him to be. She said, "Adanna. He is a good man." Adanna said, "I know. I have always known." A pause. She said, "That is the thing about all of this that makes me most angry. Not what Emeka did to you, though that makes me angry, but what it almost cost me. I almost lost the ability to trust what I know about my own life because of what someone else chose to do in theirs." Celeste held the phone. She said, "But you did not lose it." Adanna said, "No, I did not." The divorce proceedings took 4 months from the first formal filing to the final decree, which Franklin told her was neither fast nor slow but appropriately paced for a situation in which the documentation was comprehensive and the opposing party had eventually understood that contesting the terms was going to be more expensive in every sense than accepting them. Emeka had contested nothing in the end. He had hired a lawyer, a younger man from a firm in Victoria Island who had reviewed the documentation Franklin had assembled and had reportedly advised his client, in terms that reached Celeste only through the filtered language of legal correspondence, that his position was not a strong one, and that the most sensible course was to reach an equitable agreement and conclude matters cleanly. The house remained Celeste's. It had always been Celeste's, purchased in her name before the marriage, documented clearly and unambiguously, and Emeka had understood when his lawyer explained it to him that this was not a point he could contest without significant expense and negligible prospect of success. The joint account was divided according to an audit of contributions, which reflected, in the cold, clear language of financial record, exactly what Celeste had told Franklin in his office on that first morning. Her salary had been the primary source of household income for the full 6 years of the marriage. Emeka's contributions had been inconsistent and diminishing and had effectively ceased 18 months ago. The audit said this without drama because audits do not do drama. They simply reflect what is. She did not feel triumphant when the decree came through. She had not expected to, and she was not. What she felt was something quieter and more complex than triumph. She felt the specific sensation of a structure being completed. Not a beautiful structure, not one she had chosen or designed or wanted, but a structure nonetheless with a beginning and a middle and now an end, and the end having arrived meant that the space it occupied was now available for something else. She sat in her studio in Yaba the afternoon the final documents came through, and she looked out the window at the street below, and she allowed herself to feel all of it without trying to organize it into something more manageable. The grief for the years. The anger, which was still present, which she had stopped trying to rush through because her mother had told her that anger in response to genuine wrong is not a weakness but a form of accurate perception, and that the goal is not to eliminate it but to make sure it does not become the thing that defines you. The relief, which surprised her every time she noticed it, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a weight they could not name and has finally been allowed to set it down. The uncertainty about what came next, which she had decided to treat not as a problem but as a condition, temporary and navigable. She sat with all of it, and then she called her mother. Her mother answered, and Celeste said, "It is done." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come for dinner tonight. I am making egusi." Celeste said, "Yes." She came. She sat at her mother's kitchen table in Gbagada in the house she had grown up in, at the same table where she had sat as a child doing homework and as a teenager doing the work of becoming herself and as a young woman coming home to show her parents what she was building in the world, and she ate egusi soup and EBA, and she felt, in the particular way that the homes of mothers can produce this feeling in their adult children, like someone who is being held by something larger than herself. Her mother said little during dinner. She did not need to. The food was what she had to offer, and she offered it fully, and that was, in the language her mother had always spoken most fluently, enough. After dinner, Celeste washed the dishes while her mother sat at the table, and they talked the way they talked when there was no particular agenda, moving across subjects with the easy, unhurried quality of two people who have been talking to each other for 34 years and have learned not to waste that history on small performances. Her mother said, "What are you going to do with the house?" Celeste said she was going to stay in it. Her mother looked at her. She said, "There were people who suggested I leave. Friends who said the house would carry too much memory and that a fresh start required a new space. I listened to them and I thought about it carefully." Her mother waited. She said, "But the house is mine. I chose it and I paid for it and I made it what it is, and the garden is in it and the work is in it, and none of that belongs to him. He is gone from it. I am still there. I am not going to let his absence redefine what the house means to me." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Your grandmother would have said the same thing." Celeste smiled. It was a real smile, not performed, not assembled for the occasion. It arrived from somewhere genuine, and she let it. The wedding was on the 14th of March, 8 weeks after the Tuesday morning that had changed everything. The church was in Ikoyi, and it held perhaps 200 people, and it was full. Chidera's family had come from Enugu in numbers that filled 3 rows on the right side and spilled into the 4th. A large, warm-voiced family who greeted everyone they encountered with the enthusiastic genuineness of people who consider the arrival of new family members a cause for sincere celebration. Adanna walked down the aisle on their mother's arm. This had been Adanna's decision, made quietly and without fanfare, in the weeks after everything had happened. Their father was 9 years gone, and she had always known she would walk without him, had made her peace with that grief in the years since, but she had assumed she would walk with a brother-in-law. When the situation resolved itself as it had resolved itself, she had simply turned to their mother one evening and said, "Will you walk with me?" And their mother had looked at her and said, "I was wondering when you would ask." So their mother walked her down the aisle in a deep burgundy wrapper and a gelly that she had tied herself that morning at 6 o'clock with the precise and practiced hands of a woman who has been tying gelly since before either of her daughters was born, and who considers this particular skill a form of self-respect. Celeste stood at the front of the church as chief bridesmaid and watched her sister walk toward her, and she felt something arrive in her chest that was large and clean and entirely without complication. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was inside it. Something more specific. The feeling of watching a person you love completely be exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they were always going to do, and understanding that all the difficulty that preceded this moment was not the point of the story but the path to it. Adanna reached the front and stood across from Chidera, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the particular attention of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to be fully present for the experience of having found it. He reached out and took her hand. The dress moved when she walked, the white silk and broderie anglaise lace that had been made for her and only her, that bore the specific measurements of her body and the specific adjustments of Madame Bose's 30 years of experience, that had been through more in the 8 weeks since it was collected than any dress should reasonably be asked to survive. It had survived. It was here. It was exactly where it had always been going. Celeste stood at the front of that church, and she was not crying, not yet, but she was close to it in the way of someone who has decided to let themselves be moved by what is genuinely moving without managing it into something smaller. The ceremony was conducted by a pastor who had a gift for saying the essential things without saying too many things, which is the rarest and most valuable quality a person can bring to any ceremony. He spoke about the nature of commitment and about what it means to choose someone not only in the comfortable moments but in the difficult ones, to show up not only when showing up is easy but when it requires something real from you. Celeste listened to this and thought about showing up. She thought about her mother showing up with a container of food on the night everything fell apart. She thought about Adanna showing up at the Palms 3 months before she said anything, carrying what she saw and not setting it down until the moment Celeste needed it. She thought about Yetunde making the call she did not have to make, showing up in the way that cost her something and choosing to do it anyway. She thought about Chidera sitting across a kitchen table on a Thursday evening and listening. She thought about herself, standing in a wardrobe in the early January morning, looking for a navy scarf and finding instead the beginning of the rest of her life. She had shown up for that. She had not chosen it, but she had shown up for it, completely and without retreating, and the showing up had led here, to this church, to this morning, to her sister's face when Chitara said "I do" in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the building. After the ceremony there was a reception at a hotel in Victoria Island that had a garden courtyard strung with warm lights and tables covered in white linen and food that arrived in waves with the generous and slightly overwhelming abundance of a Yoruba celebration that has been properly organized. There was music from a live band that understood its job was to make people happy and discharged it with professional enthusiasm. There was dancing that began before the food was served and continued well after it was finished. Celeste danced. She had not expected to dance. She had thought she might stand at the edges of the joy of the evening, close enough to feel it but not quite inside it, which was perhaps the appropriate position for a woman who was 4 months into the aftermath of her own marriage ending. But the evening did not give her the option of edges. Her mother pulled her onto the floor during the third song, and once she was there she found that dancing was, like grief and like anger, something that the body knows how to do without instruction when the conditions are right. She danced with her mother and with Adanna's friends from university who had known Celeste since they were all young women becoming themselves, and who welcomed her back into their circle of warmth with the uncomplicated generosity of people who have never stopped thinking of her as someone who belongs there. She danced with one of Chitara's brothers from Enugu, a tall, quiet man named Adanna who turned out to be an unexpectedly good dancer and who made her laugh twice during the same song, a real laugh, the full and unhurried kind. She sat down eventually, slightly breathless, and accepted a glass of cold water from a passing waiter. She sat alone for a moment at the edge of the courtyard where the warm lights ended and the garden began, and she looked at the dancing and the people and her sister in the center of it all, and she let herself simply be in the moment without asking the moment to be more than it was or less than it was. Her mother appeared beside her and sat down. They sat together without speaking for a while, watching the dancing. Then her mother said, "Adanna is Chitara's youngest brother. He is an engineer. He builds water infrastructure in underserved communities. He has never been married. He has, from what I observed this evening, a very good laugh." Celeste looked at her mother. Her mother looked back at her with an expression of complete innocence that fooled neither of them for a single moment. Celeste said, "Mama." Her mother said, "I am simply providing information. What you do with information is entirely your own business." She stood up and went back to the dancing with the dignified momentum of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say and requires no further discussion of the matter. Celeste sat alone and looked at the garden and felt the warm lights above her and heard the music and the laughter, and she thought about what her mother had said. Not specifically about Adanna, but about information. About what you do with it. She had spent the last 4 months receiving information she had not asked for and doing things with it. Making decisions, drawing lines, protecting what needed protecting, building the structure of the next part of her life on the cleared ground of the honest understanding of what the previous part had actually been. She was not finished. She understood this. The work of becoming who she was now going to be was not complete and would not be complete for a long time. But it had begun, properly begun, on a foundation she had built herself from the materials available to her, which were honesty and her mother's egusi soup and her sister's courage and Franklin Adeyemi's organized mind and the particular quality of clarity that arrives, eventually, when a person has looked directly at a true thing long enough and allowed it to become simply what it is. 3 months after the wedding, Celeste finished the client project that had been spread on her drafting table on the morning Yetunde called. She had taken longer with it than she had originally planned, not because she had been distracted but because she had allowed herself the luxury of full attention, of being completely inside the work in the way she had not been completely inside anything for longer than she could precisely identify. The project was a renovation of a family home in Alupaju, a house that had belonged to the same family for 40 years and that needed, in the words of the elderly woman who owned it, to feel like itself again without forgetting what it had been. Celeste had understood this brief immediately and completely. She had known how to do this because she was doing a version of it herself. When the project was completed and the elderly woman walked through the finished rooms and stopped in the sitting room and stood very still for a long time and then turned and said, "Yes, this is it, this is exactly it," Celeste felt the satisfaction of work done well move through her in the clean and particular way it moved through her when the work was genuinely right. It was hers, that satisfaction. It had nothing to do with anyone else, and it required nothing from anyone else to sustain it. She drove home through the evening Lagos traffic, and the radio played something she did not know, and she left it on because it was pleasant, and she arrived at the house as the last of the daylight was leaving the sky. She stood in the garden for a while. The things she had planted were doing what they were always going to do, growing with the patient indifference of living things that do not require attention to sustain their essential nature, that do what they were designed to do regardless of what is happening around them. The bougainvillea on the back fence was blooming in the specific deep pink that it bloomed in every year at this time. The basil was healthy. The small lime tree she had planted 3 years ago had produced its first serious fruit that season, and she had made a pepper soup with it that her mother had declared acceptable, which from her mother was indistinguishable from exceptional praise. She stood in the garden in the evening light, and she was entirely herself in it. Not a wife. Not a woman in the middle of an ending. Not a woman in the early stages of a beginning. Simply herself, standing in the garden she had made, in the house that was hers, at the beginning of an evening that belonged entirely to her. She had dinner alone, and it was a good dinner, and the house was quiet around her, but it was not empty in the way that houses are empty when they hold a loss. It was the quietness of a space that has been cleared and is waiting, without urgency, for whatever is going to fill it next. She thought about the list she had written at this kitchen table 4 months ago. She had stopped managing his image. That had been the easiest of the 4 things, it turned out, because once she stopped doing it she found that she had not wanted to do it for a very long time, and the stopping felt less like discipline and more like putting down something that had never belonged to her to carry in the first place. She had told the truth about the miscarriage. Not to everyone, but to the people who mattered. She had told Adanna, who had held her hand across a coffee shop table and cried the tears that Celeste had not cried at the time, because at the time she had been too occupied with being strong for a husband who was already, though she had not known it then, choosing distance over presence. She had told 2 friends who had asked gentle questions over the years that she had answered with the minimum required to redirect the conversation. She had told them fully, and they had received it fully, and the telling had not broken her. It had made her lighter. She was working with the genuine pleasure she took in her work. She had always taken pleasure in it. She was simply no longer apologizing for how much. And the 4th thing, find out who I am now. She was finding out. It was not a single discovery. It was a series of small ones, arriving at irregular intervals with no particular fanfare. The discovery that she was funnier than she had been allowing herself to be in recent years, that the part of her that made people laugh had been operating at reduced capacity for a long time and was returning now with some enthusiasm. The discovery that she liked eating alone more than she had expected to, that there was a particular quality of attention available to her at a table set for one that was not available at a table set for 2. The discovery that silence, which she had sometimes feared in the years of the marriage, afraid of what it meant when a shared house went quiet, was in fact one of her preferred conditions, that she was someone who needed it and was sustained by it, and that this was not a flaw. She was finding out. Tabena called her on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the wedding. He called because Chidera had given him her number, and he had wanted to call for 3 weeks and had finally decided that waiting longer was simply a way of allowing uncertainty to make a decision that he should make himself. He said this in the opening of the call, plainly, without decoration, in the manner of a man who has decided that honesty about his intentions is a better way to begin than performance. She was in her studio when the call came. She had a pencil in her hand and her material boards in front of her, and she answered without looking at the screen. He said, "This is Tabena, Chidera's brother. We danced at the wedding." She put down the pencil. She said, "I remember." He said, "I am calling to ask if you would like to have dinner. Not as a performance of any kind. Simply dinner with someone who made you laugh twice during the same song and who has thought about that on several occasions since." She sat back in her chair. She looked at the studio around her, the material boards and the pencils and the window that looked out over the Yaba Street and the work that was entirely hers and the life that was being rebuilt, slowly and honestly, on a foundation she had poured herself. She thought about what her mother had said about information and what you do with it. She said, "I am not in a place where I am looking for anything serious. I want to be honest about that from the beginning." He said, "I am not asking for serious. I am asking for dinner." She thought about that for a moment. She said, "Thursday works for me." He said, Thursday works for me too. She put down the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of the studio. Then she picked up the pencil and went back to her work because the work was there and it was hers and it was good and the Thursday dinner could exist alongside it without displacing it. That was the discovery she had not expected, and that turned out to be the most important one. That the things she was building did not compete with each other. That the work and the family and the slow, careful opening toward whatever came next could occupy the same life without any of them diminishing the others. That she did not have to choose between being whole and being open. That she could be both at once. She had spent 6 years managing the competition between what she needed and what was asked of her, quietly and without complaint, and she had become so practiced at it that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She was noticing now. She was noticing the difference. Adanna called that evening while Celeste was making dinner. She called to tell her that Chidera had been offered a significant project in Abuja, a cultural center commission that he had been working toward for 2 years, and that they were going to be in Abuja for at least 18 months beginning in the summer. She said it with the bright, slightly breathless energy of someone delivering news that is large and good and slightly terrifying in the way that all large good things are slightly terrifying when they arrive in actual form rather than anticipated form. Celeste said, "Adanna, that is wonderful." Adanna said, I know it is. I am allowed to be terrified and know it is wonderful at the same time." Celeste said, "Yes. That is exactly right." They talked for an hour. They talked about the Abuja move and about Chidera's project and about Adanna's work. She was a photographer and she had a commission of her own in Abuja that had arrived, with the improbable timing that sometimes governs these things, within days of Chidera's news. They talked about their mother, who was planning a visit to a sister in Port Harcourt, and who had announced this plan with the air of a woman who has been meaning to make this trip for 10 years, and has decided that now is the time. They talked about small things and large things in the way that sisters talk when the difficult period has passed and they are back on the solid ground of the ordinary life they share. At the end of the call, Adanna said, "Celeste," she said, "I know you are finding your way. I can hear it. I just want you to know that from where I am standing you are doing it exactly right." Celeste said, "I do not always know what exactly right looks like." Adanna said, "I know. That is how you know you are doing it." She hung up and Celeste stood in the kitchen in the house that was hers, and the dinner was almost ready and the garden was outside in the evening dark doing what gardens do in the dark, which is grow quietly and without witness, sustained by nothing more than what they have always had and what they have always needed. She was doing the same thing. She served herself dinner and sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly, and the food was good and the house was quiet and she was entirely herself in it. That was enough. She was beginning to understand, considerably more than enough. It was the whole thing. It was the thing she had been working toward and had not had the language for, and was only now, sitting at her own kitchen table at the end of an ordinary Thursday, beginning to be able to name. A life that was entirely hers. Built with her own hands, from the honest materials of who she actually was, on the cleared ground of what she had survived, in the direction of whatever was coming next. She did not know what was coming next. She had decided to find that interesting. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If the story moved you the way I hope it did, check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you will find something there that stays with you. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is always more to come. See you in the next story.